The res folder is a much larger folder. In the default Android project that we've created here, we don't actually even have all of the folders that can exist in the res folder, all the subfolders here. But I'm going to go over them all, and just so you have a good idea of what kind of folders could be here. The first is an anim folder. It defines animations. If we had this, we would just create a folder under here and put our animations, call it anim. And that would define like 2D animations that allow transitions between screens and buttons and zoom in, zoom out, those type of things. Next, you would have potentially a color folder, which you can use to define state list colors, which basically means like if you have a button pressed, you can define in that what the color for anything being a button being pressed is, or all kinds of other states of your UI. You can define what the color settings should be for that. Then we have drawable folders, which we actually have some here, and I'll get into the naming convention a little later. Everything after this dash is actually part of the naming convention that allows Android to select which folder to grab a resource from. In this case, these drawable folders all essentially are going to have the same purpose, which is to hold things like PNGs, JPEGs, GIF files, scaled vector graphics, shape drawings, that anything that you draw on an Android screen that the graphics library supports drawing directly to the screen. Then you're going to have the menu folder. The menu folder we don't have here because we don't have any menus in our default application. But the menu folder is going to contain your menu files, which we'll get to that in a later module when we actually create a menu. The raw folder, also not here, is any kind of raw file. Like in my pacemaker application, I use that for the sound files that said speed up or slow down. Basically any kind of file that you're just going to want to read as binary data and do something with. It's a little different. There's some confusion of whether or not should you put this file in raw or assets, which we hadn't covered yet. But essentially the difference here is that a raw folder is going to just give you that thing, that file, but not give you the hierarchy or the original file name. If you just care about like a sound clip, you might not care about what the file name is or how it's stored. The assets folder you can use if you want to create a directory of things that you actually care about what the actual file name is and how it's stored in that directory. So the next one is the layout folder. The layout folder, we already have a main.xml here, and it contains basically just the layout. If you're familiar with WPF or Adobe Flash, it's the same type of thing. It's just an XML defined layout, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Also, you have the values folder, and the values folder, we already looked at this a little bit. It contains the strings.xml. It's going to contain anything that's a basic set of values like integers, colors. You can put lots of different simple resources here into one file or into multiple files that define things that are just going to be straight value, kind of dictionary, have a key and a value type of things. We also have an XML file, or an XML folder, which is not here. And the XML folder is basically for more of generic XML. You can use a method inside Android called getXML, and it'll be able to read things from that folder. Configuration files of certain types have to be saved in an XML folder here. The preferences, once you create preferences for your application, they'll go into the XML folder. And I'll show you real quick how that we would create a new file here that would go into one of these folders. It makes it pretty easy here in Eclipse. So we can go to New, and then we can go to Other, and then I can go to Android XML file. And then here you can select the type of file, and by default it's going to put it in the right location, is the folder here. So you can see how when I change some of these, it changes where the resource file is going to go. So it actually makes it really easy for you. You don't really even have to think about this, but it's good to know where each of these files are when you're trying to find what you're looking for. The next thing about resources here in Android is that each folder, remember how I said what comes after this dash here is important? Basically, each folder can be localized, and it can also have a different screen resolution, and you can combine the two. It can get fairly complicated, so I'm not going to delve too far into this, But if you want to find out some more, you can look it up in the Android documentation. But essentially, whatever comes after this dash, if we had dash ES, for example, for Spanish, you could have Android automatically select that as the correct resource. A good example is the strings. If you think about it for the values here, if we had values ES and then we had another strings file in there, then when the user was set to Spanish localization, they would get the values from that string file. And you can do that with all your resources, and you can do the same thing with resolution so that you can control based on if they have a high density or low density or medium density resolution, they can get a specific resource file. So that's all there is for the resources directory. That's probably the most complicated directory that we have, and the subdirectories that are involved there. And as you're working with your Android application, you'll find that you'll be using more of these subdirectories, even though they're not in the default project here.